All right, Max, tell me about what's been happening in the world of combat sports, and I think you got a little bit of a recap for us just to wrap up 2020.
Yeah, there's no UFC on till later in January, which my next Combat Corner, I can't wait to talk about the first three headline main events. But since this is the last episode of 2020, I thought I'd do a bit of a recap of the year for all things UFC. So I'm going to walk us through my top 5 fights, my top 5 finishes, and my top 5 fighters. I'm going to start at fights. So the criteria I had for deciding fights were the stakes of the fight, the technical level of the fight, and the story of the fight. There's no set weight for each of those three criteria, but all three of these fights sort of check those boxes in one way or another. So at number 5, I've got the July, I believe, main event between Robert Whittaker and Darren Till. Till was coming off his middleweight debut in which he looked hesitant but good against Kelvin Gastelum, and Robert Whittaker was coming off his loss of title to Israel Adesanya and a self-admitted mental burnout where he had booked a fight and then had to withdraw from the fight. Just depression, burnout. He wasn't ready to fight, but he took the time off. He rejuvenated his mental health and he came back ready to fight, and it showed in a really entertaining is a tough word. I said, so the stakes of this fight were huge because Till was looking for a middleweight shot and Whittaker needed that win to stay relevant in the title picture. That takes, when you've just lost to the champ and fairly decisively, you need to build a strong case to get yourself back. And it was the story of the fight that really cemented this pick for me. First round, Till drops Whittaker with an elbow, I believe, out of southpaw position. Took the round. Second round, Whittaker drops Till, I think it was a straight. So they both pretty quickly realized that each guy could finish the other and they had to be very careful. And it just turned into one of the most hold your breath, intense striking, kickboxing chess matches I've seen. They were so close to each other, just feint. They didn't throw a lot, which makes it a bit of an outlier compared to my other 4 fights. But the main reason I picked this fight was because when the 5th round ended, I just let out a breath. I didn't even know I was holding in. I was so tense the whole fight because they were both able to drop each other and were both playing so close. It was so technical. You really didn't know what was going to happen, even though there wasn't a lot being thrown. One of my favorite parts was how they kept testing each other with head kicks and showing the reflexes and timings to duck under them. Whittaker has a nasty head kick. He's shown on multiple occasions. Till's just a gorilla, so always terrifying when he throws that. I think Whittaker won the fight mostly because he fucked up Till's knee with an oblique type kick, and Till couldn't really move after that, so he had to counter strike, and that was when you saw the momentum shift to Whittaker. It was just a high level, technical, terrifying, exhilarating fight between two of the best kickboxers in the UFC. Really fun fight to watch, and it got Whittaker that much closer to a title shot. Next fight, our most recent UFC pay-per-view main event, Davison Figueiredo versus Brandon Moreno. I just talked about this fight, so it feels a little weird to recap it again, but in terms of stakes, UFC flyweight on the line. In terms of storyline, they were both coming off first round finishes 3 weeks ago. In terms of story of the fight, the scoring wasn't dead decisive, but you could kind of factor in Figueiredo winning the first round, Moreno winning the 4th round, the 2nd and 3rd round being up in the air, which made the 5th round that much more intense. This fight could have shot to the top if the 5th round had been as exhilarating, but neither fighter really kept pace. I mean, Figueiredo had been waning off the 4th round. He did enough to take the 5th and bring the fight to a draw, which is an intriguing storyline in itself, because I'm almost certain we're getting an instant rematch. Not record-breaking number of significant strikes thrown relative to some of the other fights on this list. It didn't. It was a great fight. I feel like I'm kind of defending not having it ranked higher with this piece, and I feel a little bad taking away, because watching Devson Figueiredo throw those strikes that had put Joseph Benavidez in worlds of trouble twice this year, and watching Moreno just eat them and walk forward and put on the pressure and try and break Figueiredo was amazing. So that's where I'll leave my recap of that fight at for number 4. Number 3, we got Alexander Volkanovski, Max Holloway 2. Excellent fight again for the title rematch, coming off Volkanovski's decisive point win over Holloway in December. You're wondering what adjustments was Holloway going to make, and he made some great ones. He came out in the first 2 rounds and dropped Volkanovski at the end of each of them, setting him up looking like he was going to coast to take the fight, but Volkanovski came back into it. I don't know what exactly he figured out to stop getting dropped, but he figured it out. He kept putting on the pressure. He mixed in some wrestling. He made it grimy. He was still very faint, step in, technical, super hard fight to score. I have not watched the fight 47 times, as some have, but have watched it a couple times. After watching it live, I thought Holloway had taken 4 of the rounds pretty easy. I've watched it since and don't feel quite as strongly about that. It's just a really awesome fight for the featherweight division. So frustrating because you don't know what you do with those 2 very dominant, evenly matched guys, other than let them go through a little gauntlet and hopefully they're both still at the top and can meet for a trilogy. But it was a great fight, and so the stakes were there, being for the UFC featherweight. The storyline in the fight was there, with Holloway dropping Volkanovski getting back up and doing it. The entertainment was there in the sense that it was a very busy fight. So that fight earns number 3 for me. Number 2, we got Dustin Poirier versus Dan Hooker. Not a title fight, but in the UFC lightweight division is so competitive, so stacked, that a 5-round main event between 2 of the top 5 guys probably gets me more excited than a title fight in like half of the UFC divisions at least. So in terms of stakes, this was right up there for me. Dan Hooker had earned this spot with a close, violent, honorable mention for fight of the year against Paul Felder earlier in February. And we kind of saw more of the same within the fight. Hooker came out very fast, very aggressive, very dominant. He totally outstruck Hooker in the first round, looked great. The second round was more even, but Hooker really hurt Poirier with a knee, pouring it on. It looked like the finish could have come at the end of the second round if there'd been a few more seconds, but Hooker kind of blew his load. And similar to the fight I just described between Volkanovski and Holloway, with Poirier in a similar situation to Volkanovski being down 2 rounds. You can't make a mistake. You have to win every round from there on. And Poirier did that much more decisively than Volkanovski. He came back. Hooker was exhausted, but he was exhausted because Poirier is so dang tough, so got out of the way enough, made Hooker throw everything in the kitchen sink at him, weathered enough of it, dodged the rest of it, and then was able to bring his own storm to Hooker. And suddenly it was Hooker's turn to survive, which he did. A lot of panic wrestling in there to get the job done. I think in the 4th round, I was kind of surprised. Poirier, I thought he was going to finish Hooker on the ground. He didn't. Dan Hooker is one of the toughest guys in the UFC. You just have to watch the absolute beatdown Edson Barboza put on him to understand that. No quit in him. And you can say the same about Dustin Poirier. And when those 2 guys are also 2 of the most skilled fighters in one of the most interesting divisions, a 5-round banger with a ridiculous number of strikes thrown and landed, near finishes coming from both guys. I mean, Dustin Poirier is gonna fight Conor McGregor on the back of that win. You don't just have to consider that aspect, understand how important the fight was. You think about Habib Nurmagomedov saying before his fight with Justin Gaethje and before we and probably he knew he was going to retire, he was saying Dustin Poirier is the man to beat right now at the lightweight division to earn another shot. So the title implication was there, the entertainment factor was there, the technical level was there. Awesome fight. In other years, this might have been the number one fight of the year, but that spot was long since cemented in March between Joanna Jędrzejczyk and I'm going to butcher it, but Zhang Weili for the UFC women's strawweight. Oh my God, that fight was one of the best fights of all time. Absolutely the best women's mixed martial art bout of all time. I don't even know where to start talking about it. It was just 5 rounds of non-stop kickboxing action. It was, but so much circling, so much feinting, so many games being played with the leg kicks, the checking, it was basically 5 rounds of circling, feinting, and then mixing in one single hard blow, and then mixing in like 4 or 5 piece combinations with each fighter trying to time the other. Joanna leaning more on jabs and straights and power leg kicks. Weili leaning more on hooks to counter Joanna with inside leg kicks. But don't get me wrong, she threw plenty of straights more as a single shot that would time Joanna. Joanna's my girl, so I'm so bad at scoring fights when I have a bias for the fighter. Her I can't think of the word for it, but she shows damage quite easily on her face. She had one of the most brutal hematomas to ever emerge out of a fight. She had a second head on her forehead, essentially. I think that probably cost her the fight. I mean, it was a split decision, 48-47, so as close as you can score a fight. She had a similar hematoma against Jessica Andrade, except she was so dominant in the striking, obviously, that it didn't weigh into the decision making. She certainly wasn't that dominant in this fight. I did think she edged it in most of the rounds because I look for damage when I'm trying to score fights, but if you don't see, I look for damage in the posture, the reactions, more than like the face swelling and the side, unless we're talking about bruising. That's a little different than swelling and cuts, I think. And the only time I really saw damage to Joanna was in the second. Weili had her in the clinch and landed a couple that made Joanna back up, circle, and take her time. So I wanted to give Weili the second round based off that, but the rest of the rounds I thought Joanna edged it, especially when you look at the leg kicks. I thought that the power to the outside of the leg was doing more than the inside, but I don't want to take too much or put too much of the focus on the scoring because it was just such a high level, crazy, super entertaining fight. It was so awesome. One of the best fights. I don't know how you can watch it and not come away feeling that way. The feinting, the circling, the reads, the constant striking, the never back down, but not doing anything too reckless, too stupid. It was everything and more you could ask for in a title fight. I guess I'll end by saying these fights make me wish you didn't have to decide who won a fight with scoring, because especially Joanna versus Weili and Volkanovski versus Holloway, they were such close fights with, in my opinion, so far away from having a clear decisive winner. I really wish there was some way we could just see the rounds go on until one fighter wilts, and whoever stays strong, stays going, wins. I guess you don't want like a Muhammad Ali, George Foreman trilogy type situation where both fighters are literally about to die, but that's also considered one of the greatest fights of all time for a reason. So what a set of fights. There's so many honorable mentions I haven't even gotten into, but those are my top 5 and I feel pretty good about them. Moving on to top 5 finishes, I had a couple, so I'm mixing submissions and KOs for this, and we'll get into this, but I'm not just considering the finishing sequence, I'm considering the whole fight, and I think that will make more sense as I get through the list. So my considerations for this are the stakes, the setup, and the aesthetic of the finish. So those will all come into play in different ways. So number 5, mainly an aesthetic. Earning this spot, Cody Garbrandt's knockout of Rafael Assunção. Walk-off knockout with pretty much 0 seconds left in the second round after a good but close 2 rounds, a top 10 bantamweight fight. Garbrandt really needed this one. If he had lost, I don't know where his career would be at now, probably prematurely, but he's already in the conversation to get back cracking at the title. But I think part of it was just how poised he looked for this finish. Striking back against the cage, backing up, not a great position to be at, but he just timed Assunção so perfectly. Watched Assunção wind up, ducked, got out of the way, stayed picture perfect for a sec, and just swung the hook and put Assunção to sleep. Walk-off KO, round ends, and the ref had no choice but to call it, even though the round was over, because Assunção was not getting up anytime soon. Number 4, I've got Davison Figueiredo's second finish of Joseph Benavidez. So the two fighters had already met once in February, where Figueiredo missed weight. And the story of that fight was kind of Benavidez looking good with the jab, good with the straight, timing Figueiredo pretty well until he wasn't, when Figueiredo started to find his power shots later in the second round and worked his way to the finish. But because he'd missed weight, he wasn't eligible for the belt. So they book a rematch. And the question was kind of, what adjustments are Benavidez going to make now that he's had that experience once? How can he dominate like he did but not get caught? But we didn't really even get a chance to see that, because Figueiredo, just little God of War, came out of the gate so violent, more explosive, more aggressive, and didn't give Benavidez a chance to get in the fight, landing power shots. Just had him so hurt and was searching for the finish pretty much throughout the first round. And he found it in absolute, like, barbaric, grueling fashion with one of the scariest rear naked chokes I've seen. He had Benavidez's eyes popping out, and there's this one camera angle I saw where just absolutely terrifying. So it's not just the submission I'm giving the finish for, I'm giving it for the strikes that set it up. Again, the stakes, that's what won Figueiredo his flyweight title, which he's now defended twice. Great finish by Figueiredo. In very similar fashion of this is the whole fight, not the finishing sequence earning this spot, I give my number 3 finish of 2020 to Justin Gaethje for his technical knockout of Tony Ferguson in the 5th round. Now, if you just watch the finish, you'd see Justin Gaethje land 1 or 2 hard strikes to Ferguson on the feet. Ferguson dance away, turn away, look just silly in his walking, and Herb Dean come over to stop it because Ferguson clearly can take no more. And those couple strikes in and of themselves don't tell the story of this finish. The story of this finish is a 5-round, beautiful masterclass of striking put on by Justin Gaethje against a guy that 12 had tried and 12 had failed to do just that in a row against Tony Ferguson. So, I mean, this also was the first main event back for the UFC since COVID, so that added to the storyline of this fight. I mean, Tony Ferguson was just the boogeyman. It seemed like no one could stop him, and he was going up against a there were questions about Gaethje, what he would look like against a guy as high level as Ferguson, who was going to be harder to put away than a Donald Cerrone or a James Vick. And you kind of thought this fight was going to turn into a brawl and that Ferguson would just do what he continued to do. But Gaethje proved everyone wrong. He didn't change the way he fights wholesale. He made these little adjustments, little reductions, little better timing, little better striking defense, and it just turned into a beautiful 5-round performance. He got clipped by one uppercut from Ferguson, but other than that, it was near flawless with his leg kicks, his head movement, his ability to step out, land 1, 2, 3 shots depending on the striking sequence, and then get right back out of danger and not let it turn into a brawl. Coaching moment of the year from Trevor Whitman in this fight, telling Gaethje after he got clipped at the end of the second round, stop swinging, take 10% off, and you're going to take this guy out. It took 5 rounds because Ferguson is just so from another planet level of toughness, but he earned the finish, and Justin Gaethje took the mantle of scariest guy in the UFC lightweight division for a second. But then my number 2 finish goes to Khabib Nurmagomedov for reminding everyone that no, there are levels to this. And despite Justin Gaethje looking nigh unstoppable against Tony Ferguson and so good, Khabib made him look silly. Again, I'm considering the whole fight, not just the finish when I say this, because I think how the first round played out had an effect on the second round. Khabib tried to put the pressure on, and Gaethje said, no, I'm going to be the one who pressures you. And Khabib just said, okay, and he showed a part of his game we sort of saw against Conor, but not as fresh in the first round, where he was just so athletic, so quick, so explosive on his striking defense that, like, yeah, Justin Gaethje landed a couple, but you rarely win with like a couple against a guy who's moving backwards, defending intelligently. And he made Gaethje look human. And Gaethje could only put the kind of pressure he needed to stay out of danger on for a few minutes before he was the one running away. And then Khabib was just chasing him and chasing him. He stayed patient. He found his takedown at the end of the first. He set up an armbar pretty quickly. I think 10 more seconds and he might have taken the armbar, but he just got right back to it in the second, making Gaethje work at 110%, waiting till he made a mistake, and putting that chain wrestling. If the first takedown doesn't get you, he'll get a better position with it. If that better position doesn't get him a takedown, he'll get a better position with it. And if you're still thinking along this train of thought, boom, you're on the ground. And then Khabib just right to mount, set up the triangle, went onto his back. We'd seen very little of the jiu-jitsu game of Khabib. His submissions before seemed to more come from just breaking the opponents. If you look at the Michael Johnson, Dustin Poirier, and Conor McGregor finishes, all 3 of those men were broken by the time they tapped. Khabib didn't even try to break Justin. He just flawlessly set up a triangle and took it, faking which arm he's going for, maneuvering Gaethje just how he wanted him. The second he had him where he wanted him, no hesitation, rolled right back into the triangle. I mean, you couldn't have picked a better opponent at that moment in time for Khabib to retire against. Time will tell as the lightweight division now shakes out in the post-Eagle era, who is at the top of the lightweight division, but Justin Gaethje, Conor McGregor, and Dustin Poirier are 3 of the top 5 names you've got to say. And Khabib's made it look easy against all 3 of them. What a career, what a privilege to watch. When we talk about the mixed martial arts greats, I think we will always talk about Khabib. And this was just such a flawless performance against such a dangerous guy. Gaethje, like I said, he made it look easy, so it takes my number 2. I feel like I've betrayed myself a little after giving those 3 storyline finishes by picking the number 1 finish as being Joaquin Buckley's kick, but you've seen this finish. There's a reason I'm picking it at number 1, and I don't think it requires much explanation. I mean, If you somehow haven't seen this finish, look it up right now. But essentially, he threw a body kick, it got caught, leveraged himself with the foot he still had on the ground into a spinning wheel kick that landed right on the chin, put his opponent to sleep. Not high level stakes, not a high level storyline, but the aesthetic of that finish, I think, probably puts it in like the top 3 knockouts in UFC history. So how can you not give the number 1 spot to Buckley? Not a lot to say. I feel a little cheated having told what I think is just a beautiful story now for the number 2 spot and the number 3 spot and the number 4 spot, and then having to revert to just, oh my God, that was wild. But oh my God, that was so fucking wild. I have no choice but to give it the number 1 spot. So last in my list of accolades, I've got my top 5 fighters of 2020. So I chose strength of schedule, pretty much sums up my choice. How many times did you fight, and what was the level of opposition you fought? And then performance. How did you look in your performances? A couple, I'll say honorable mentions before I get into this to Israel Adesanya and Valentina Shevchenko, both UFC champions who defended their belt twice, but Adesanya did so once in one of the worst title fights in UFC history, so had to deduct some points for that. And in a list this tight, that's all it takes. And Valentina Shevchenko, just Jennifer Maya and Caitlin Chukagian don't get the respect from me that some of the other names on this list I'm about to go through do. So I knocked Shevchenko off the list for that. But I mean, defending the belt twice in a year is what I like to see from champions. So I thought I'd start by just shouting out those two, even though they didn't crack my top 5. Number 5 on the list, Gilbert Burns, who earned himself the number 1 contender spot in the UFC welterweight division in 2020. First with a second round, I think, knockout of Damian Maia, which is very impressive. A lot of people have beat Damian Maia, Colby Covington, and Kamaru Usman, but neither of them did it with a knockout, and neither of them had the grappling ability to go with Maia, whereas Burns got into a scary grappling situation, got out of it, got back on the feet, and found a beautiful knockout. Then set him up for a main event against Tyron Woodley, which he took and put on a clinic against Woodley. You've got to mention this in the context of Woodley has dropped 15 straight rounds, and 5 of those in the middle were against Burns. Still, great performance by Burns, mixed up the striking, mixed up the grappling, looked dominant, earned himself a number 1 contender spot at welterweight, was supposed to have the fight against Usman in July. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was July, but had to pull out due to COVID. One pretty familiar story in the sports 2020 world. I think that fight now is supposed to happen in February. I don't think it's been signed yet, though. I'm not really sure what's going on with it. All the same, great year for Gilbert Burns, number 5. Number 4 on my list is going to Kevin Holland for his strength of schedule. He had 5 straight wins in between May and December this year. That is absolutely ridiculous. And the last win was the most impressive with that absurd knockout of Jacare Souza. Maybe I should have put that in an honorable mention for top 5 finishes. But another one of those knockouts was against Joaquin Buckley, who had the number 1 finish earlier on the list. He's put himself in middleweight contention. I'm sure he'll be taking a main event very soon, and he has an opportunity to get his name in title contention real quick with that 5 straight wins. Not the highest level of competition, but when you do it 5 times and you have plenty of finishes mixed in there, then yeah, I'm going to reward that highly. So great year for Kevin Holland. Number 3, I've got Charles Oliveira. Charles Oliveira, 2 wins, similar to Gilbert Burns. Just the state of lightweight versus welterweight, Oliveira isn't quite the clear-cut number one contender Burns is, but he's been just as, if not more impressive based on strength of competition. Wins by submission guillotine over Kevin Lee, and that 3 dominant round performance against Tony Ferguson I just talked about. The finish against Lee, also probably honorable mention. Beautiful guillotine reversal on a takedown that he finished from half guard, which takes a crazy squeeze. You almost never see that. Earned himself the spot against Tony Ferguson on short notice, which he stepped up and took it flawlessly. You've got to think he's might have a shot at the UFC lightweight title in his next fight. If not, he's absolutely 1 win away. Great year for Charles Oliveira. Number 2, I've got Jan Blachowicz. Jan was coming off an interesting 2019 where he had a knockout loss to Thiago Santos, which cost him his opportunity at the belt. He then had a beautiful comeback knockout against Luke Rockhold, and then an absolute stinker split decision, low pace win over Jacare Souza. 2020, got himself booked a main event spot against Corey Anderson, who had a dominant win over him much earlier in their careers. Jan came in the underdog and knocked Anderson out in the first round. Legendary Polish power, which earned him a spot at the Open UFC light heavyweight title after John Jones relinquished it against Dominic Reyes, who had just looked fantastic against John Jones. Again, coming in the underdog, proved everyone wrong. Right back to that Polish power. These crazy hard body kicks that left bruises I've never seen anything like, especially with like 2 or 3 of them. He did it with his lead leg, absolutely terrifying, and just set up again that Polish power. He found it on Dominic Reyes. We're going to need a couple more fights from Dominic Reyes, a couple more fights from John Jones before we know how much John Jones has lost form and how much of a fluke Dominic Reyes' performance was on that night in February against John Jones. But for now, we have to say John Jones is still a great fighter, and Dominic Reyes brought it to him, and in my and I think most people's opinion, won the fight. So when you go in against that guy and then make it look easy like that and capture the title, I mean, enough said. People were talking about his grappling for so long, myself included, but he's really made it clear that his striking is very dangerous, very high level, can finish anyone in the division. It's got himself a super fight set up with Izzy, which I have mixed feelings towards. We'll get to that later, but my absolute pleasure to give Jan Blachowicz my number 2 spot on this list. Number 1 is going to be no surprise to you if you've listened to this podcast before. I said all Deiveson Figueiredo has to do is get the win against Brendan Moreno, and he's cemented it. Now, he didn't get the win, but he kept his title and put on a hell of a show. So that's good enough for me. With his 2 finishes over Benavidez, his finish over Perez, and then that war with Moreno, 4 fights against top 5 guys in the UFC flyweight division, earned himself a title, defended that title. Enough said. Deiveson Figueiredo went from a relatively unknown quantity to the number 1 flyweight fighter in the world without a doubt. The only guy who's really put a challenge on Demetrius Johnson's legacy in that division. He's kind of saved it and resurrected it. People are no longer talking about scrapping the flyweight division whatsoever. They're talking about how could we ever have thought about scrapping this division, and that is mostly due to Figueiredo. So again, my absolute pleasure to give him the number 1 spot. And that wraps up my combat corner. We'll be right back to talk some basketball.